I am an alpha, yet I found myself entirely obsessed with my own kind. Richard, the absolute top-tier alpha in this city. Usually the way he looked at me was like I was nothing more than toxic waste polluting his air. Until that night, 5 years ago, he was accidentally slipped a heavy dose of an inducer. I didn't bother playing the noble gentleman. I pinned him to the mattress, claiming his first time with an inescapable, absolute domination. After I had him, I ran. I knew damn well that once this apex predator woke up, he would never let me walk away. I erased every single trace of my existence. Word on the street was that he went completely insane looking for me over the last 5 years, laying down a ruthless vow. The second he caught me, he would obliterate me completely. But 5 years later, we crossed paths at the airport. The terrifying, crushing gravity that always surrounded this untouchable man completely pulverized into dust. With the corners of his eyes flushed a raw red, his arms dead, locked around my waist. And he actually broke down in tears. I didn't even have the chance to push him away before a little girl, a miniature replica of me, came running over. In a crisp, sweet voice, she called out, "Daddy!" In that exact microsecond, the air went dead silent. The atmosphere around Richard warped and twisted under a blistering, destructive heat. His eyes completely bloodshot, his absolute composure entirely shattered. He roared at me. "Matthew, you actually found an Omega to have a kid with?" City, A International Airport. The golden light of the setting sun slanted through the floor, 2 ceiling windows, coating the bustling departure hall in a hazy tangerine fuzz. Amidst this chaotic flow of light, Matthew tilted his head up slightly, his gaze dead, locked on a figure in the distance. It was Richard, a top-tier alpha, capable of freezing the very air in his vicinity. He was even more blinding than he had been 5 years ago. His black trench coat cut a frigid silhouette against the light. With every step he took, the ambient light around him seemed to be sucked into a black hole, manifesting into an incredibly suffocating, deep purple undercurrent. That was the absolute crushing gravity unique to a top-tier alpha. There was no scent in the air, but visible, transparent ripples radiated outward, mercilessly expanding with Richard at their epicenter. Matthew lowered his eyelashes in self-deprecation, concealing the trembling, fragmented glimmer deep within his pupils. 5 years ago, it was he who had taken advantage of the drug in Richard's system, forcefully claiming the first time of this highly traditional alpha. The entanglement of that night had been like a catastrophic wildfire. Even now, Matthew could almost feel the phantom burn on his fingertips. He knew that the look in Richard's eyes when he woke up, a look that wanted to swallow him alive and peel his skin from his bones, doomed them to a reckoning that would only end in death. Matthew, a hoarse murmur, carrying a tremor suppressed to the absolute limit. Before Matthew could even react, a heavy, blistering embrace completely locked him in place. Richard's heavy breathing crashed against the crook of his neck. In that split second, the freezing, deep purple undercurrent surrounding them abruptly detonated, shattering into countless brilliant golden specks of light that frantically wrapped around them both. The specks seemed almost alive, desperately trying to drill into every single pore of Matthew's skin, aiming to completely mark and claim him within this narrow space. "It really is you. They all said you were dead." Richard's fingers dead, locked onto Matthew's lumbar spine, his knuckles turning white from the sheer force. The corners of his eyes were a furious scarlet. He looked exactly like a lone wolf who had wandered the wasteland for 5 years, only to finally recover its most precious treasure. "How could you bear to die? How did you dare to die?" But Matthew's face remained utterly cold. With brutal force, he pushed away that golden halo. Looking at Richard's handsome yet ghastly pale face, the corner of his mouth pulled into a cynical, worldly smirk. "Mr. Richard, 5 years no see, and your acting skills have certainly improved. Weren't you the one who swore to completely obliterate me, to tear me limb from limb?" Richard opened his mouth. His originally lethal gaze, upon meeting the absolute frost in Matthew's eyes, actually shattered into a blank, disoriented mirage. He wanted to explain, wanted to desperately grab hold of those dissipating golden specks of light, but was completely pulverized by the sound of crisp, quick footsteps. "Daddy, I missed you so much." A tiny figure came sprinting over, crashing straight into Matthew's arms. It was an exquisitely sculpted child, and those crystal-clear, slightly upturned phoenix eyes were an exact replica of Richard's. In that single second, the wind in the airport corridor seemed to completely stall. Richard stared dead at the child. The air beside him began to violently warp, and those once gentle golden specks of light instantly caught fire. His Adam's apple bobbed with agonizing difficulty, his voice sounding as if it were being squeezed through shredded vocal cords. "Matthew, you actually found an Omega and had a kid?" Matthew could feel the fury that was practically hot enough to cause burns. He pulled the child tighter into his arms and let out a deliberately provocative laugh, though the depths of his eyes remained a dead, silent wasteland. "Is that not allowed? I've reached the age to settle down and start a family. What about you, mister?" "Richard, still not married?" Richard's fists cracked audibly, the veins on his neck bulging like coiled dragons. The dark crimson flames surrounding him were roaring frantically, looking as though they would incinerate all three of them into ash in the very next second. And yet, in those bloodshot eyes, beneath the absolute fury, hid a trace of desperation so profound it cut straight to the bone. Night fell, and warm yellow lights clicked on in the living room of their new home. It was their first dinner back in City A. His close friend, Anthony, meticulously placed peeled shrimp onto Matthew's plate. Justice held her milk cup, her little face flushed, chattering excitedly. "Daddy, that handsome uncle this afternoon was so weird. When he got close to me, I felt like so many stars lit up all around me. It was so warm and super comfortable." Matthew's hand, holding his chopsticks, froze slightly. Bloodlines truly were like a silent, inescapable curse. After dinner, taking advantage of the sleeping child, Anthony lowered his voice by the entryway, tentatively asking, "Matthew, are you really not going to tell him the truth? Justice needs a father, and you. He is not Justice's father. He is just an enemy who wants to tear me limb from limb." Matthew cut him off, his face looking exceptionally pale in the shadows. The wind outside brushed through the treetops, the distant neon lights flickering on and off. Matthew leaned against the doorframe, his fingertips gently rubbing the old scar on his wrist. It felt as though the overbearing, blistering residual heat left by that Alpha 5 years ago still lingered there. He looked at Anthony's gentle face under the light, and finally, exhausted, closed his eyes. "This is a fresh start, Anthony. In this city, Matthew has already died once. Those unspeakable clashes of pheromones, that past repeatedly scorched by golden specks of light and dark crimson flames, let them rot forever in the ashes of the fire from 5 years ago." The dim streetlights bled a warm, fuzzy halo into the deep autumn night. Matthew turned around, his footsteps halting abruptly. Standing right at the boundary where the light met the shadows was the man who had sworn to obliterate him completely. With more than half his body hidden in the dark, Richard's shoulders were dusted with the cool night dew. That terrifying top-tier aura that usually possessed the power to tear the surrounding air apart was completely gone. Sketched by the soft orange light, his silhouette revealed nothing but a crushing, overwhelming loneliness. For a fleeting moment, even the wind around them seemed to slow its pace, and Matthew actually entertained an unrealistic phantom illusion. "This man in front of me doesn't actually hate me all that much." But the second that hoarse voice rang out, the warm filter was violently shattered. Even with a kid, you still can't change your nature of needing to hook up with alphas, can you? The heavy scent of evaporated alcohol, accompanied by a surge of dark crimson sparks from the depths of the shadows, instantly detonated in the air. This was the physical manifestation of Richard losing control. The dark red sparks spread frantically around him like venomous vipers of jealousy, warping and completely devouring the warm halo of the streetlights. He lunged out of the shadows, dead, locking his grip around Matthew's wrist with a force strong enough to crush the bone. What is so great about Anthony? He's just a fringe player. You stick with him, and you won't get a single drop of his family's power. Richard's eyes were crawling with horrifying red veins, his chest heaving violently. Those scorching dark red sparks surrounding him practically burned against Matthew's cheek. "Matthew, why are you always so easy? Why do you have absolutely zero self-respect? Have you ever thought about how your kid will feel when she grows up and finds out her biological father is this kind of trash? Every single word was like a rusted blunt knife, precisely plunging into the softest part of his heart and twisting brutally. Matthew looked at the man in front of him, who spoke with such absolute self-righteous conviction. His tightly clenched jawline betrayed a pale, agonizing endurance. Just because he had loved him once, did that mean he deserved to be trampled and humiliated at will? Smack! The crisp sound of a slap split the heavy night. Matthew forcefully broke free from his grip, coldly withdrawing his trembling fingertips. Those arrogantly coiling dark red sparks were instantly pulverized by the merciless strike falling as ash. That has absolutely nothing to do with you. The corners of Matthew's eyes flushed a vivid raw red from extreme fury, but his voice was completely devoid of temperature. Richard, absolutely nothing about me is any of your business, and you have no right to lecture my child. Whether in the past or right now, in the eyes of this favored son of heaven, Matthew would always be that promiscuous, inherently despicable trash in the mud. He had never once deemed him worthy of a genuine look. How the hell does it have nothing to do with me? Instead of backing down, Richard acted like a rabid, cornered beast, his hands violently clamping down on Matthew's shoulders. The scattered sparks around him abruptly erupted into a terrifying, blistering heat, roasting the air until it nearly boiled. Even the beams from the streetlights warped and twisted agonizingly beneath this absolute, authoritative gravity. Matthew, from the exact moment you provoked me, you should have known that you would never escape me in this lifetime. You don't get to just walk away without paying the price. If you're sick, go see a doctor. Don't act like a lunatic in front of me. Matthew forcefully shoved away that blistering body, straightened his crumpled collar, turned, and walked away. Matthew, you were the one who said you liked me. Richard's completely shattered, broken whisper came from behind. Matthew's footsteps faltered slightly. Yes, he had said that himself. But how he wished he had never spoken those words. Ghastly, pale memories flashed alternately in Matthew's mind. Cold, coarse needles piercing his arm again and again, the violently warped alpha gland seeping sticky cold sweat in the dead of night, the ornate, heavy doors of the family estate slamming shut mercilessly amidst the roar of a thunderstorm, his deranged, desperate Omega father screaming hysterically in the mud. Those dark years of being an unmentionable illegitimate child, forcefully matured amidst filthy calculations, were like a low-quality black and white film playing at double speed, brutally compressed into a few seconds of ringing in his ears. Ultimately, all the chaos came to an abrupt halt in the dead of winter when he was 10 years old. The bone-chilling river water, thick with broken ice, slowly swallowed the temperature from his body. Just as a young Matthew prepared to sink into the lightless abyss alongside his father and welcome the finality of death, the endless howling blizzard surrounding them suddenly stopped. Pure, blinding golden light pierced through the heavy ashen clouds. Like a gentle tide, it poured down, instantly chasing away the extreme cold that had frozen his very soul. 19-year-old Richard stood on the shore, backlit by the light. At that time, he was a flawless, pristine moon, a deity descending into the mud. He reached out his hand to the dying Matthew. The breathtaking heat radiating from his palm traveled through Matthew's frozen fingertips, branding itself all the way into the absolute deepest core of his heart. Matthew woke up to a room washed in sterile white. The morning sun danced across a bouquet of dew, kissed daisies on the nightstand. Beside them lay a note, bold, elegant, and impossibly tender. The fever is gone. The rest of your life is yours to keep. That golden light breaking through the dead of winter became the only anchor in Matthew's fractured soul, his most lethal salvation. Back then, a boy clutching the edges of a hospital sheet made a silent vow. If this perfect moon ever needed it, he would lay down his life without a second thought. And eventually he did exactly that, letting the fire consume half of his soul. Across the campus, Matthew's silhouette followed like a moth drawn to a flame, forever haunting the shadows cast by Richard's path. Pile after pile of club forms, the fleeting breeze of every brush past, 2 years of a hollow, silent pursuit condensed into a series of hurried, aching snapshots. Then came the trap woven by Thomas, and the world bled into a suffocating darkness. Inside that dim room, the terrifying weight of a high-tier alpha's rut manifested as a visible, toxic emerald haze. It slithered up the walls like a slick serpent, hardening into inescapable crushing chains around Matthew's ankles. He collapsed, his knuckles turning a ghostly white as he fought the chemical fire in his veins, his chest heaving, his shirt drenched in a cold, desperate sweat. The door burst open. Richard stood backlit by the harsh hallway light. There was no salvation in his eyes, only a cold, clinical judgment. A crown of razor-sharp, silver icicles manifested around Richard, their edges reflecting a jagged, unmistakable revulsion. The tiny spark of hope in Matthew's soul was pulverized into dust the moment he met that gaze. In the days that followed, rumors flew like black, winged ravens. Neon lights flickered wildly over ugly shadows of Alpha's and Tomas' piercing mockery, until Richard's cold voice cut through it all. In the hollow silence of the lab, the fluorescent lights stretched their shadows into a standoff. Matthew's lips trembled as he tried to speak, but Richard turned away first. As he drew closer, the silver ice around him exploded, fracturing the air itself. A lethal frost pressed against Matthew's throat. "If you think you can play games with me, Matthew, you'll pay a price you can't afford." Richard's voice was sharper than the ice. He looked away, his jaw set in a line of absolute impatience. "I'm done seeing you. Your name, your shadow, it's all just noise." Matthew froze, the red veins in his eyes spreading as the world blurred behind a veil of despair. He was a marionette with severed strings, shattered and pathetic in the cold silver light. Then the scene shifted. A breeze rippled through the emerald wheat fields outside his grandmother's house, the sunlight bathing the world in a soft, healing gold. Matthew let his exhausted soul soak in that peace until a black SUV shattered the stillness of a puddle's reflection. Under the sun, Richard's tall silhouette stepped into the countryside with his sister, Laura. Matthew, hidden in the shadows, gripped the wooden doorframe until his nails left white marks. He was a bird ready to take flight, but Laura dragged him back into the light. The next few days were a blur of gurgling streams and lazy afternoons. Through Laura's stories, Matthew looked past the blinding aura and saw the fractures in the deity, a pawn for business, an heir abandoned by love. The heavy, cold mission of his family had become a crown of black thorns, strangling the man Matthew worshipped. Matthew listened, his heart seized by an invisible hand, every breath laced with a subtle, sharp ache. On the night before they left, the sky was deep and clear. The promised meteors never came, but inside the tent, Laura's breathing was steady and calm. Outside, tens of thousands of fireflies rose from the grass, a surging sea of warm, golden stardust. In that healing glow, the permanent frost surrounding Richard finally thawed. Half his face was lost to the moonlight, the other bathed in the fragile, flickering warmth of the fireflies. Matthew held his breath, protecting a cluster of light in his palms, his eyes tracing the line of Richard's nose, the flutter of his lashes. "Matthew," Richard said, breaking the silence. The ice shards around him melted into a soft, golden aura the moment the fireflies touched them. "If you like someone, do you stay that way forever?" Matthew froze. A firefly took flight from his hand, its spark illuminating his red-rimmed eyes. He gathered every ounce of strength in his soul. Always. The night wind died down. Richard's cold features softened. A ghost of a smile, like the first break of spring, touched his lips. The golden light replaced the thorns, enveloping the grass in a tender, unreserved embrace. Matthew's heart hammered against his ribs, nearly shattering his chest. "Richard, can I be your friend?" Fireflies circled them in the dark. Richard watched the alpha boy whose eyes were burning with hope. Finally, he tilted his head, the moonlight catching his jaw. "Fine, but you have to lose those bad habits of yours." Autumn at the university arrived, sunlight paving the paths in gold. Samuel in S-Class Alpha was the son everyone worshipped. When Matthew led the tour, he collided with Richard's dark, smoldering gaze. Though no words were spoken, the aura around Richard contracted into a gray, suffocating undercurrent, a cold sting that felt out of place in the bright morning. Matthew eventually learned the truth. Samuel was Richard's half-brother. That night, Matthew stood like a ghost outside Richard's apartment. Behind the warm windows, Richard stood with a graceful Omega on his arm. The ivory light wrapped them in a picture, perfect scene of healing. In the dark corner outside, Matthew felt like his chest was stuffed with wet cotton. He turned his pale face away, fleeing like moss that couldn't survive the sun. At 11 that night, the street lamps stretched Matthew's running shadow. Richard had said one thing, "Matthew, I want to see you." He ran 12 miles without stopping. When he finally skidded to a halt before Richard, sweat traced the red corners of his eyes, his heaving chest barely containing his heart. Under the orange glow of the lamp, Richard stepped closer. His fingers, long and elegant, tilted Matthew's chin upward. He leaned in, his kiss carrying the cool edge of the night wind. "You ran so fast. Were you that desperate to see me?" In that moment, Richard's eternal winter vanished. His scent became a soft golden stardust, a tender dream dancing in the air, wrapping Matthew in an inescapable, almost greedy embrace. "Stay away from Samuel. Be obedient, and I won't go through with the engagement." In that drowning gold, Matthew's lashes trembled as he fought back the sting of tears. He nodded, over and over. But the dream was pulverized by the news of the engagement. Matthew couldn't reach him for 3 days. Finally, a text arrived. "Come to the hotel." That evening, the sunset bled across the sky, staining the carpet of the hotel corridor a raw, tragic crimson. The moment Matthew pushed the door open, boom. The once calm air was instantly torn to shreds. Drugged out of his mind, Richard's top-tier alpha presence lost all control, erupting into a tyrannical, dark gold storm. The light in the entire room warped under the terrifying heat, and even the air let out an agonizing, overwhelmed groan. Richard's eyes were bloodshot. Like a beast devoid of all reason, he violently dragged Matthew into the suffocating, dark gold vortex. "Richard, let me go. Let's get you to a hospital." Matthew struggled desperately, heavy drops of cold sweat beading on his forehead, his fingertips trembling in sheer terror. But the only answer he received was a tearing, excruciating agony at the scent gland on his nape. Richard's stark, white canines mercilessly pierced the fragile skin. The surrounding dark gold storm instantly crystallized into countless razor-sharp blades of light, brutally shredding Matthew's final cry for help. "Isn't this exactly why you asked me here? Drop the act." The alpha's dormant reproductive cavity was forcefully breached again and again by the rampaging power. The intense agony made him throw his head back, his elegant neck pulling into a tragic arch. Matthew's fingers dug deep into the pristine white sheets, his pale lips bitten until they bled. In a union that should have been filled with love and healing, only the dark gold blades, like the scorching fires of purgatory, slashed madly, burning Matthew's soul and dignity to ash, inch by agonizing inch. When he opened his eyes again, he was met with blinding, cold fluorescent lights. The harsh, sterile stench of antiseptic filled the air. Richard stood backlit by the hospital bed, his towering frame casting a shadow as deep as an abyss. His thin lips were pressed tightly together, his eyes utterly devoid of warmth. The air around him froze into a manifestation of fine, drifting frost, falling silently. "From this day forward, without my permission, you are not allowed to step 1 foot out of here." With the heavy clack of an iron door locking, Matthew was mercilessly thrown into a psychiatric facility specifically designed to imprison the discarded trash of elite families. 4 months condensed into the slowly withering leaves outside the barred window. On an exceptionally quiet afternoon, a single ray of warm, healing sunlight struggled through the rusted bars, falling on Matthew's skeletal frame. He sat rigidly on the edge of the bed, his trembling fingers gently resting over his slightly rounded lower abdomen. From within, there came an incredibly faint movement, like the flutter of butterfly wings. Inside this despair-filled cage, Matthew lowered his head, biting his pale lower lip until it nearly bled. Through that single, weak ray of sun, his red-rimmed eyes stared blankly at the pregnancy test he had so desperately managed to acquire. On it, 2 blinding red lines were pushing his already shattered life into a bottomless abyss from which there was no return. On a night filled with torrential rain, Matthew, like a moth chasing the very last sliver of light, stumbled and fled from the asylum. He naively believed that if he just laid everything bare, he could beg for even a single ounce of pity from Richard. However, when he pathetically threw himself at the ornate doors of the engagement banquet, what greeted him was bone, chilling, absolute zero. Richard looked down at him from high above. In that very microsecond, the temperature of the top-tier Alpha's aura plummeted. The brilliant, luxurious lights of the banquet hall seemed to instantly freeze solid. The air materialized into countless, razor-sharp, silver icicles glinting with lethal frost. Following Richard's heartless gaze, those icicles mercilessly struck toward Matthew's thin, frail body. "What are you waiting for? Drag him away." Accompanied by that completely temperatureless command, Matthew, like a piece of broken trash, was heavily thrown onto the freezing, muddy streets by the bodyguards. A black sedan glided slowly to the curb like a phantom. The window rolled down, revealing Samuel's face, a face that bore a resemblance to Richard's, yet was twisted with absolute malice. Unlike Richard's extreme, freezing domination, Samuel was surrounded by a nauseating, dark green mist of light. The air grew impossibly foul, choked by his twisted calculations. "You won't survive tonight, because you are an indelible stain on his perfect life." The corner of Samuel's mouth curled into a cruel smirk as he shoved a phone screen right into Matthew's face. The ghastly white halo of the screen illuminated Matthew's bloodless face. The truth was like a rusted, blunt knife. The drugging, the seduction, the capture that night, it was all a dead-end trap meticulously orchestrated by Samuel. His hypocritical offer to help Matthew escape was nothing more than a scheme to turn him and his unborn child into a lethal bargaining chip to completely destroy Richard. The howling wind whipped up the fragmented foam at the edge of the cliff. Facing the inescapable net Samuel had cast, Matthew fiercely shielded his abdomen. An astonishing light of a desperate counterattack erupted in his eyes. With absolute finality, he leapt into the bottomless ocean. However, the scene did not descend into suffocating darkness. The exact second the freezing seawater rushed over his head, a colossal, warm, vibrantly alive morning sun roared up from the horizon. That golden, ultimately healing dawn transformed into countless gentle ribbons of light, piercing through the water and securely catching the falling Matthew. The lens shifted. On the streets of a foreign land, the warm spring sun baked the cobblestones. Anthony extended a warm, broad hand, the scattered gold of the sunlight dancing on his fingertips, steadily pulling Matthew up. Inside a cozy nursery, newborn Justice let out a loud, clear cry, and the entire room was instantly filled with a soft, pinkish gold halo. In this warm, vibrant life force, those countless, gaping wounds quietly began to heal. 5 years later, it was the same psychiatric hospital, but the lighting was entirely different now. Sunlight streamed through the pristine blinds of the visiting room, casting warm, steady lines across Matthew's calm, composed face. Sitting opposite him, the once arrogant Samuel was tightly bound to a chair. The arrogant, dark green mist that once surrounded him had long since shattered, trembling like dying, withered leaves. "It was you. Richard thought you were dead. He went completely insane and locked me in here." Samuel's face was twisted, struggling hysterically, the handcuffs clattering harshly. Matthew sat there quietly. He radiated a soft, warm jade-like light that had survived the fire, gentle yet absolutely unviolable. He leaned forward slightly. There was no hatred in his eyes, only a detached, peaceful release. "From the very moment you tried to use me and my child as bargaining chips, this became your destiny. Every ounce of suffering you endure, you brought upon yourself." In this 5-year-long chess match, he had not only broken free from his fate as a pawn, but had won back his own life in the bright sunlight. Pushing open the heavy doors of the asylum, the outside world was bathed in a breathtaking golden afternoon. A breeze brushed through the towering sycamore trees, sending a shower of golden leaves dancing through the air. In the center of this warm, healing light, Anthony stood quietly, holding the exquisitely sculpted Justice. Seeing Matthew walk out, a ripple of pure tenderness filled Anthony's eyes. He didn't ask a single question. He just naturally, steadily offered Matthew his hand. "Let me hold your hand as we walk." "Okay." This time, witnessed by the gentle breeze and the warm sun, Matthew smiled in true release. He reached out and tightly grasped that grounded, steady warmth that finally belonged to him. That same night in City A, the truth, buried in silence for 5 years, finally broke through its cocoon. When he received the irrefutable investigation report, when he learned that justice was his own flesh and blood, when he realized the sheer scale of the calculations and despair from all those years ago, the oxygen in Richard's study was instantly vacuumed out. The ice and remorse suppressed for 5 years instantly transformed into a violently burning crimson storm. That red anomaly furiously shredded every single piece of furniture in the study, completely obliterating the eternal, cold facade of this favored son of heaven. Faced with the delayed truth, he finally tasted the agonizing bone, piercing pain, and Samuel, trapped in the abyss, was completely driven mad that very night. However, all the chaos and the collapse of those power plays no longer mattered. Under the warm yellow light on the other side of the city, Matthew was gently patting his sleeping daughter in his arms. Outside the window, the stars dotted the sky. The night breeze was soft. He permanently shut those terrifying heart-stopping memories, along with the Alpha's remorse, outside the door of this home filled with love and new life. Late that night, a torrential downpour swallowed the entire city without warning. The streetlights warped into blurry, cold halos in the curtain of rain. Richard, like a wandering ghost abandoned by the world, stood rigidly outside the iron gates below Matthew's apartment. The once untouchable top-tier Alpha, who was always surrounded by a suffocating gravity of absolute power, was now so pathetic he was almost unrecognizable. The once tyrannical dark gold anomaly surrounding him was battered by the freezing rain, leaving only a few weak, dying sparks. The second they flickered, they turned into miserable white smoke, completely annihilated in the mud. Yet, separated by just a single wall, the second-floor windows spilled out massive swathes of warm, brilliant orange halos. It was the candlelight for Justice's 5th birthday, an absolute sanctuary of healing that not even the torrential downpour could breach. Holding a clear umbrella, Matthew stood quietly beneath the eaves. Not a single thread of his coat had been touched by the freezing damp. "What do you mean it no longer matters?" Richard's hands dead, locked onto the freezing iron gates, his knuckles turning a horrifying, ghastly white from the sheer force. He tilted his head up, rainwater cascading wildly down his pale, sunken cheeks. His voice was as hoarse as if it had been ground over coarse sandpaper. "We were separated for so long entirely because of a misunderstanding. And now, with just one single sentence, you're simply discarding me." Matthew quietly watched the man with the bloodshot eyes standing before him. It wasn't until this very second that Matthew finally realized the truth. The Alpha who had once shone with the flawless, untouchable halo of a deity in his eyes was, in reality, nothing more than an ordinary, selfish, and utterly pathetic predator. Once the perfect filter, forged entirely by a one-sided, desperate devotion, was pulverized to dust. The seemingly terrifying storm surrounding Richard could no longer stir even a single ripple in the depths of Matthew's heart. "Richard." Matthew's lips curved slightly, his eyes reflecting a profound, crystal-clear tranquility that no storm could ever shatter. "There was never any so-called misunderstanding between us. Everything that happened simply took its natural course. When I desperately tried to explain, you dismissed me with absolute disdain. Now, whatever you have to say, it's simply too late." Richard froze in place as if struck by lightning. His chest heaved violently as he desperately tried to reach out and grab onto something, anything. "Matthew, I will make it up to you however you want. The truth is, I fell in love with you so long ago. If Samuel hadn't sabotaged us, we would have been together from the very start. And Justice would have a complete family." Accompanying his desperate low roar, a few shattered specks of golden light bled futilely from his fingertips. Yet, they couldn't even graze the warm, resilient sanctuary that enveloped Matthew, the absolute defense of a true home. "With or without you, Justice will always have a complete family." Matthew didn't lower his head to look at him. Instead, he tilted his chin up slightly. His gaze cut straight through the curtain of rain, landing with profound tenderness on that glowing, warm window on the second floor. Behind the glass, Anthony was smiling, gently placing a golden paper crown upon Justice's head. On this man, whom Richard had dismissed as a mere fringe player, there were no violent, tyrannical pheromones. Instead, he radiated a constant, grounded, soft light, like the dawn of a spring morning. That light pierced through the glass, resting quietly against Matthew's profile, completely illuminating the very last trace of gloom in his eyes. "I am incredibly happy now," Matthew said softly, his tone carrying the unbreakable, indestructible strength of a man who had weathered every storm. Richard's pupils violently contracted. The absolute last glimmer of pleading in his eyes was utterly pulverized by Matthew's calm, love-filled smile. This once untouchable, arrogant alpha finally stumbled backward like a hollow shell drained of its soul, melting completely into the endless, dark, rainy night. A few days later, the lazy sunlight of early winter drifted across the wooden desk. A pristine white envelope was sliced open. On the paper, there was only a single line of frantic, messy handwriting. "Whether you believe it or not, locking you away back then was truly to protect you." Sss. A match was softly struck. The dancing, warm orange flame swallowed the letter, without a microsecond of hesitation. Holding a steaming cup of black tea, Matthew watched calmly as the fire reduced that heavy, suffocating past to charred ash. The ash drifted out the window on the breeze, melting away into the warm sunlight. The truth was, whatever the actual reality had been, it truly didn't matter anymore. Accompanied by a heavy, hollow boom, the rusted iron gates of the psychiatric asylum in the distant suburbs slammed shut. Inside the gates was Richard, a man who had willingly sealed himself in a cage of his own making, trapping his soul forever in an endless, freezing purgatory of absolute remorse. And outside those gates, the first snow of City A fell silently. The pure white snowflakes refracted the sunlight. Within this breathtaking, healing halo of light, Matthew gently slipped his cold, slightly flushed fingers right into Anthony's warm palm. The two shared a smile. Holding the hands of a cheering, ecstatic justice, they stepped out to meet the brilliant, warm sun, taking long strides toward their brand new life.
In this story, my heart truly aches for Matthew. Forced to present as an alpha illegitimate child, the baseline of his existence was a suffocating, swamp-like repression and profound inferiority. Yet, carved into his very bones was an incredibly resilient, indestructible life force. The tragic misery of his early years left him harboring an almost sacrificial, absolute devotion to Richard, the man who had extended a hand to save him. He was incredibly humble and enduring, willingly trailing in the shadows, and even after being brutally shattered, he still held onto a desperate hope for Richard. But he was absolutely no fragile dependent. From the moment he completely lost all hope in Richard, taking that desperate all-or-nothing plunge into the ocean to escape Samuel's lethal trap, to his dead calm, unrippled rejection of Richard's pleading 5 years later, it all proves that Matthew is deeply lucid and resolute. When he loved, he gave absolutely everything unreservedly, and when he cut ties, he severed them completely, leaving nothing but dust. As for Richard, though he wore the flawless facade of an elite aristocrat, internally he was a prisoner starved of affection, swept up in the freezing apathy of his family. Arrogant, conceited, and deeply paranoid, he was accustomed to using his absolute desire for control and devastating destructiveness to mask his own staggering fragility. Faced with Matthew's approach, he greedily craved that pure, unadulterated devotion, yet allowed himself to be entirely blinded by his lofty class prejudices and the venomous whispers of those around him. Confronted with misunderstandings, he never chose to communicate. Instead, he resorted straight to the most ruthless, merciless methods to punish what he perceived as betrayal. This sickening self-righteous arrogance and absolute inability to communicate caused him to personally, violently pulverize his own salvation. Watching Matthew reject Richard's repentance and renewed pursuit honestly brought me immense joy. In stark contrast to the aggressive, plundering domination of top-tier alphas, Anthony wielded very little power, but his nature was profoundly gentle, steady, and limitlessly accommodating. In Matthew's most completely shattered moments, he never pried into his secrets, never cast a high and mighty judging gaze. He simply, quietly provided tangible support and unwavering companionship. His actions were incredibly restrained and grounded. He never demanded absolute possession. Only a man like this could truly heal Matthew's fractured heart, and only someone like him could use silent warmth and absolute respect to build an impenetrable, safe harbor for Matthew.